if I said fighting anti-Semitism in our educational institutions, we would all go, what is going on? So I'm going to do away with my intro. I just want to hear from the two of you. Thank you so much for being here, and take it away. Okay.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Stephanie. And I just have to say that I met Julia 5 weeks ago by total chance at Kol Nidre Services. And Julia is the co-founder and CEO of Jewish on Campus. And of course, being an Illuminate board member, and I hearing that she had started and founded a not-for-profit that is in this space, I did the Illuminate thing and said, you need to be in our circle, and you need to be in a room, and we need to hear from you in this moment. And little did we know 5 weeks ago how urgent this conversation would be, and how urgent this work is. Julia is a recent graduate of University of Chicago, and as chance would have it, she was in the same class as my son. We didn't even know. She founded this organization between her first and second years of college, which, if anyone who knows University of Chicago and how academically rigorous is, that's quite impressive in and of itself. But she went on to finish her studies and her coursework 2 quarters early, because she was eager to get out and do this work. And she has been at the center of our national conversation, center of policy. In 2021, she was an honoree at the Anti-Defamation League's Concert Against Hate, and she was also one of Al Jeminer magazine's top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life in the same year. So Julia, we're so eager to get in conversation with you. And obviously everyone really wants to hear what's going on in this moment. I mean, the headlines are scary. But I think just to set the stage, I'd love to go back 3 years just to hear, why you founded this organization and how that came about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me talk about Jewish geography, ending up here from Kol Nidre. So I really appreciate it. So I founded Jewish on Campus initially as an Instagram page when I was 19 years old, summer between my first and second years of college, really with no idea or intention that it would become a nonprofit or what it is today. Really, at the time, it was 6 of us, college students from different schools, different places, all having the same experiences. And our thought was, if it's us from all of this different world, middle of COVID, making community and finding commonality across space, we can't be the only ones. So we created a platform on Instagram very simply to just have students share their stories with us, and then we can share their stories publicly. So that would, for the Jewish community, show people you're not alone. And for the non-Jewish community, show them what anti-Semitism looks like on campus. Because for a lot of folks, they just don't know what anti-Semitism is. And it grew really, really fast. And as the followers grew and people started reaching out to us on this platform, we realized that we had the capacity, but also the obligation to do more. So we decided to create a nonprofit, which today focuses on a lot of stuff, all coming down to anti-Semitism on campus and uplifting student youth voices in the fight against it. We do that through research. We do that through action. We do that through policy. We do that through media. And the focus is really on meeting young folks where they are on campus and online, and doing work to educate against anti-Semitism and to combat it when it's rising.
Yeah. So we're just going to get there. I mean, what are you seeing, vis-a-vis the rise in anti-Semitism on campuses over the last month? What is actually happening, and what are you hearing from your students? I mean, obviously we heard a bit about Cornell, but you're working with campuses across the country. So what is that looking like?
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue that has been growing for years. It didn't just, pop up in the past few weeks and become what it is today. It's been this slow growth that I think is just reaching a fever pitch now. And like was said earlier, I mean, you can't turn on the news even or read an article without seeing this. And for a lot of folks, myself included, it's especially challenging because we're also worried about family, worried about friends in Israel who, are facing probably the toughest moment that our community has faced in a generation, if not 2 generations. And so, trying to grapple with what we're experiencing here while still balancing the fear that we have for our family there is really difficult. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so misunderstood. A lot of the question that students are having is, I feel so connected, I feel so impacted, but my peers don't understand that. They don't understand why this connects to me. I'm an American Jew. I'm from Long Island. Why should I care? I'm sure half the room is from Long Island too. And it's because I'm sure the same is for all of you guys. I don't know a single student that I've spoken to who's more than 1 or 2 steps removed from this issue. Everyone knows someone who's struggling. Everyone knows someone who's missing or killed or fighting, and it affects all of us in a really deep way. While that's happening, there's a rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric and language that we recognize because we have long-held experiences with antisemitism. We're able to recognize blood libel. We're able to recognize tropes of power that are often wielded as tools against the Jewish community throughout our long history being reimagined into language that is recurring today in 2023. And it's difficult. I mean, I think one of the big things that people are talking about is, well, how can we criticize without slipping into anti-Semitism? Where is that line? Because a lot of folks don't fully understand or recognize where anti-Semitism starts. And I mean, I say this as someone who makes home in progressive spaces, who, with a lot of my friends, was in Tel Aviv last summer, a part of the protests against judicial reform. There's a line. And when the humanity of folks in Israel is being taken from them, civilians, because of where they're born, I think if you've put it in that framing, it's really easy to understand where that xenophobia, where that's anti-Semitism, and where those double standards lie. And there's the capacity to care for the suffering of multiple people at once. You can and should care about the suffering of Israelis and the suffering of Gazans. That doesn't mean that you're dehumanizing Israelis in the process. When we're seeing on campuses hostage posters being ripped down, students who identify as, bless you, who identify as Zionists in any way, shape, or form, meaning they believe Israel should exist, which for my family, my mother's family coming from Iraq, Yemen, and Spain, I mean, there aren't really a lot of Jews in those countries. There was nowhere else for us to go. The erasure of that history and the dehumanization of the Jews who live there, including children, including Holocaust survivors, including innocent civilians who, were just living their lives, including peace activists who were at a festival. I mean, these are all human beings who, for a lot of folks right now, we're watching being dehumanized, especially on campuses when we're seeing, again, those posters ripped down, students being excluded from spaces that they used to call home. And so I think that having the capacity to understand what anti-Semitism means and looks like, why the Jewish community is so affected and connected to this, and how it's being translated into our modern conversation is a piece of nuance that's missing from dialogue.
So interesting. And so you have students who are part of your organization at 70 campuses across the country. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that student union model. And then also, how are you supporting and empowering them in this moment?
Yeah, I will never forget. Years ago, I was working with some students at a school in New York who were dealing with an instance which was very much an intersection of being excluded from spaces for survivors of assault because of their identity as, Israelis. And the first thing we talked about when we met with them was, are you guys okay? Before we asked what happened to you guys, what do you want to do about it, we asked if they were okay. And they paused the meeting there and they were like, no one's asking us that. Are you okay? I think the first thing to do is to understand that before we're advocates, before we're professionals, before we're activists for people, we're Jews who are affected by this. We're Jews who are scared and struggling right now. And taking a moment to kind of recognize that nobody really knows what's going to happen in the next year. Nobody really knows what's going to happen in the next week. And so how can we hold space for that while trying to take action? Our student union is a project that has been my baby for 3 years. I'm very excited that it launched this year. And it allows students to get involved on both a national and local level. So nationally, we're holding a vote at the beginning of the year, students all over the country, to vote on what issues matter to them. So when we're saying, what do Jewish students think about? What do they care about? We can ask them themselves. And then we're able to use that to advocate for political action on those values. And then also locally on campus, we're focusing on peer education. We're focusing on activism in a grassroots way. We're never going to tell students you should be doing this. They're going to tell us what they need, and we're going to help them find it.
Interesting. So we're obviously seeing many educational institutions getting it wrong in this moment, and many have failed to denounce hate speech as they are adamant about preserving free speech and an open forum for debate and discourse. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I went to the University of Chicago, where that was absolutely kind of ingrained in us since day one, like free speech, free speech, free speech. And I think that that is an issue that absolutely must be preserved. In navigating this line between like a political discourse and anti-Semitism, where it gets complicated, number one, is universities have an obligation. A lot of talk goes into Title VI. We've been, really active in that space. We filed multiple Title VI complaints. Our complaint at the University of Vermont was the first to be resolved under the Biden administration, and was included in the White House National Strategy to Combat Antisemitism, which I'm sure we'll speak about later.
Can you tell us a little bit for those who don't know about Title VI?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of conversation about it now. Basically what it means, it's been upheld by bipartisan administrations now, an executive order, which means that Jewish students on campus are protected from discrimination under the identity of national origin discrimination. So the idea is that Jews share common ancestry, and therefore we're protected from discrimination based off of that. So when Jewish students don't have equal access to campus life, when Jewish students are actively excluded or have their grades penalized in campus spaces because of their identity, that's when there could be a potential violation of civil rights, and that's the time when you can file a complaint with the Department of Education. That's where the line kind of becomes difficult, because university administrators have an obligation to ensure, this is both public and private universities, and any university that gets federal funding has an obligation to ensure that their students of all backgrounds have equal access to campus, are not being penalized or discriminated against or having their grades suffering because of their identities. An example of this at the University of Vermont, it's a couple years old now, so you can see kind of the growth, but it was recently resolved earlier this year, is there was a teacher's assistant who posted on Twitter about lowering the grades of students in their class that went on birthright. Yeah, so when that's happening, obviously, that was found to be anti-Semitism. That was found to be a threat to Jewish students being able to succeed equally on their campus. And the university has to take now action to make sure that their school is a safe and equal place for Jewish students. So that's kind of the framework of a lot of these conversations of how can university administrators ensure that Jewish students have that equal access. And I think a lot of people have asked, what do you wish university administrators were saying? There are a lot of people who are unsatisfied with the response. There was a letter that Jewish on Campus and a slew of other organizations signed to 500 university administrators in North America, urging, more concrete action and concrete condemnation. I think the two most basic thing that Jewish students are looking for, number one, is for universities to just name that the Jewish community is struggling, to recognize that their students might be having a hard time and need support. And number two, to name anti-Semitism. I think Jewish students are really looking for recognition, and we've seen that in really powerful ways by folks in the White House or different members of Congress, and they're looking for that same strength to be echoed by their university administrators to show that they understand what anti-Semitism is and that they're going to advocate for their Jewish community.
Yeah, and we've seen it with other communities where that has happened. So the absence of it in this moment, I think, is speaking volumes.
Yeah, I think it's really important that all communities when they're facing a difficult moment, have support from their administrators. At the end of the day, we're all people and humans. When we're struggling, we want others to recognize that and to have space for us to, exist and do our homework. And so many students have reached out saying, I can't even get my assignments done. I'm just so nervous. I'm so worried. There were students at Tulane who, there was a a protest that a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric was used, but a student ended up getting assaulted trying to stop an Israeli flag from being burned. A whole situation, as I'm sure you guys can imagine. But the students there were like, I was scared to go to class. This was happening right in the entrance of campus. I felt like I couldn't go. I skipped class that day. I think in those situations, they really want the university to, and Tulane did, condemn the instance afterward, but I think in these sorts of situations, they want to see that their university understands it.
Yeah. As you know, we at Illuminate view all issues through a gender lens. We are uplifting leaders who are women, but also viewing these issues through a gender lens. And so how does gender play into anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, great question. I'll start by saying that, I founded this organization when I was 19 years old. It's not easy to be taken seriously in a nonprofit space predominantly run by men who are probably 50 years my senior, as a 19-year-old college student and a woman. That was, I think it's something that a lot of folks in this room can relate to. I think number one, the spaces we're looking to be advocates need to prioritize women, not just as a part of the space, but as leaders in the space. There's so many tremendous women who are advocates. A lot of them are, in this room too, and they deserve to have, the chance to be elevated as leaders because we have such important things to say. I also will say that Jewish on Campus recently did a study with Ipsos, which is one of the largest, polling research firms in the country, and it was supportive. We did a lot of research. We found a lot of important things about anti-Semitism, a big gap between how Jewish students are perceiving anti-Semitism on their campuses and the general population is. We also found that by all metrics, Jewish women are perceiving anti-Semitism and on higher levels than their male Jewish peers. And obviously, there also is space for gender diversity. That wasn't within the context of this polling, but it's something that I also want to note for members of the LGBTQ community. Obviously, that presents another layer of complex challenge. But Jewish women are experiencing this at higher levels than ever. And I think anyone also who's public in this space can say that we've all had scary experiences. We've all, been targeted specifically on the basis of our gender, as well as on the basis of our Judaism. And it's a really difficult thing to grapple with. But I also think that there are such tremendous women in this space who have important things to say, have important work that they're doing, and that work being uplifted is the biggest way to ensure that these stories are told.
Well, that's why we felt it so important to have you here today.
I appreciate it, yeah.
Because you're not only doing work on the campuses, but you're doing work on a policy level as well. And I know you've been at the center of the national conversation. In the very short time that this organization has existed, you've been invited to the White House to participate far more than probably everyone in this room. And you're also working with members of Congress. So what does that work entail?
Yeah, so almost a year ago, the White House held their first ever roundtable on anti-Semitism with the second gentleman. Beyond being the first ever, second gentleman with our first ever woman vice president. Woo. He also is the first Jew in the White House. And I think, yeah, I will never forget. I got a Twitter DM from Shelley Greenspan, who, if you don't know her, she is the most wonderful person in the entire world. She is the Jewish community liaison to the White House. So anything that the White House is doing on Jewish community stuff, she is like the go-to woman. I cannot speak highly enough of her. And she said, we're thinking of hosting a roundtable at the White House on anti-Semitism. Would you want to come? And I was like, obviously I'd want to come. But this was the first time that I'd done anything like this, and I was doing it at the White House, so I was a little bit terrified, but it was really tremendous. It was an opportunity. I mean, there were all of these tremendous organizations at the table who have been doing this work for, close to a century. And we were there too. This was before I graduated college. I actually packed up my bags in Chicago. I finished early, but I didn't graduate. I still was writing my thesis from New York while I was doing this full time. But I packed up my bags from Chicago and flew straight to DC, did this, and then flew home and unpacked and moved out of college. But it was a moment where we were able to be involved and invited to the conversation for the first time. And that also, since then, at all of these events, students and young people and women have been at the center of it. So that really was the first moment where the tide, really has turned to include students, to include folks in the Jewish community who are advocating as part of the next generation. From there, the White House announced their first ever national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, which I know, Dina, you could probably speak about it a lot as well. And we were really lucky to be a big piece of that and working with the administration, advocating for Jewish students, and bringing Jewish student perspective into the conversation. Which was tremendous and really exciting, because we can complain about these things all day. There's plenty to complain about. We're Jews. We know how to do it. But there's an important moment where we can say we're going to do something about it. So working with folks in the administration, advocating to members of Congress as a platform to bring young voices up, and having them hear directly from the folks who are living this in real time. That's our main priority. Yeah.
As you can see, the questions are flooding in here. We'll get to as many as we can, and then I know you're probably all starving, so you can continue to talk with Julia outside. But I think this is a really interesting one. That some students, Jewish students on campus, have felt that the organized Jewish community on their campuses have not necessarily welcomed new and nuanced conversations about Israel, or at least particularly in this moment. And so they've withdrawn from Jewish campus life. Are you able to draw them back in, and are you working toward any of those programs on campuses?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing now is that there's the political conversation, which is important to have, and then there also is the anti-Semitism that we're facing. And those things are so intertwined that it's hard to have space and room for both of them. And I think the biggest thing that we have to do in our spaces is to understand the experiences of the whole slew of diversity within the Jewish community, and the whole slew of perspectives, while still holding space for the real fear, the real pain that a lot of the community is facing. And so creating spaces where we're doing advocacy work, but also having conversations within the community I think the biggest thing that we're facing right now is, like, you say the word Israel and everyone recoils. They don't want to talk about it. It's so heated. It's such a difficult topic, but it is the topic that is tied to so many of our family histories, and our families live there. We have an intrinsic connection to it, so we can't shy away from those conversations. But how are we able to foster more respectful dialogue? How are we able to foster a dialogue where it's not complete line in the sand? You're either a Zionist and you hate anti-Zionists, or you're an anti-Zionist and you hate Zionists. How are we able to have complexity and nuance while respecting folks in these conversations?
Yeah, and I think we go back to our first panel with what Michal said so wisely. It's complicated, right? But what happened on October 7th is simple. So making those distinctions, recognizing that there is a spectrum of Jewish views on the issue of Israel and Palestine and ongoing relations, but also in this moment, we have to recognize that this was a massacre and what must be done. I'm going to ask one last question that's kind of broad, and please do find Julia outside afterwards if you have more questions. But, we're a room full of people who are connected to students on campuses, and we're alumni, and we're parents, and we're grandparents, and we're aunts, and so what can we do to support our students? But I think more importantly, what can we do to combat anti-Semitism on campus and to hold educational institutions accountable, and then perhaps to take it beyond the educational institutions into our communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing, and I'll start by saying I'm from Long Island. I went to public school on Long Island, very Jewish area. I was never the only Jew on my campus. The only education on anti-Semitism that I ever received in my education was a PowerPoint on the Holocaust with some horrific images that kind of stay in your brain forever, and that was it. And I went to an area where I was never the only Jew. There was a huge Jewish community. Our Jewish students and our non-Jewish students are going to campus with very little understanding of what anti-Semitism is, what Jewish community life is, and what to do about it. So I think, number one, not shying away from those conversations. I say this to my sister all the time. She's applying to college now. I would never tell someone to not apply to a school because that school is anti-Semitic. I would instead make sure that the students are instilled with the idea of where to find community. One of my closest friends, who is our COO at Jewish on Campus, he's a senior at Tufts, and Tufts makes headlines constantly for anti-Semitism, and he loves Tufts because, in spite of everything, he has a tremendous Jewish community on the ground. And I think that's the most important thing. If we're leaving these spaces, then all we're leaving is an information vacuum. We're self-selecting out of the ability to participate and to bring new ideas campus and to combat anti-Semitism in the places that need it the most. But that has to come through supporting Jewish institutions that are going to create community, that are going to create activism, that are going to create avenues of change, which I'm sure is a priority to everyone in this room as well. And in terms of combating anti-Semitism, I think the biggest thing goes back to education. Right now, the biggest issue that we're finding is that people are defining words differently depending on what kind of position you have on the conversation. We need to start with students way before they're on campus and talk to them about, anti-bias training is a really important part of our education system, and including all marginalized communities in the conversation, including Jewish community in the conversation, on what the complexity of Jewish identity is and what anti-Semitism looks like. Because if you say the word blood libel to a Jewish person, they'll know exactly what you mean. They'll say, yes, that's something that I know how to recognize. And then if you say the word blood libel to someone who isn't Jewish, they probably have no idea what you're talking about. So how can we start before proactively to make sure that this is happening, that this is educating, and then reactively when anti-Semitism is growing on campus and growing in our communities, how can we condemn it? How can we make sure that university administrators, that folks in position of power understand anti-Semitism and how to condemn it, whether they are, a congressperson or a university admin, it's important to condemn it. And how can we make sure that they are also educated on the tools of what to say to ensure that their Jewish community feels safe and supported?
And what do you think is the best way for us to be a part of that, to be a part of educating these people who are responsible for holding these spaces?
Yeah, I mean, obviously contributing to the organizations that are doing the work helps to keep them moving. But also, I think the one thing that everyone's an expert on, doesn't matter what degree you have, doesn't matter where, anything, is your story and your experience. And right now, there's such value in that, because to have a human-to-human connection, to be able to look at someone and say, okay, I understand why you feel that way, really can move folks to understand a new perspective. And so I think using your experiences, using your stories to put that into a space of understanding is essential. And obviously for folks who went to universities, who understand the campus life there, to be able to use your voice to speak to folks that you have access to that students don't have access to is really important, obviously in a way that speaks to the student experience. I think that there's a lot that young folks are doing. There's a lot that exists out there, and supporting students, making them feel safe on campus is going to help everybody in the long run.
Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you, guys.
You.
Yeah.